Hello and welcome back. Today is part 4 of Gauge Month, the importance of blocking your swatches. Today we are going to talk about why and how to block your swatches, and we'll also talk about how different fibers respond to blocking, what to do if your pre and post block gauge are different, and how to calculate growth of your final piece due to blocking. Before we hop in, I would love for you to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel. And if you're interested in how to use gauge to modify a garment to your body, check out the link to my upcoming workshop in the description. All right, let's get started. The first thing to note is that not all yarns that are labeled as the same weight are indeed the same weight. Unfortunately, this isn't as globally regulated as we all want it to be. Some DK yarns are thinner than other DK yarns, some worsted weight yarns are thicker than other worsted weight yarns, and this will affect how they work up, how they gauge, how they block. No two yarns are created exactly equally. The second thing to keep in mind is that different fibers respond differently to being crocheted or knitted up. Wool has little teeth that help it cling together. Acrylic usually holds its unblocked size pretty closely, and silkier fibers like bamboo, for example, tend to stretch a lot more when they get wet. So unless you are working with the exact same yarn as the designer, and the designer gave their pre-blocked gauge and you're matching their pre-blocked gauge exactly, there's just no way to be certain of how your yarn choice will behave in your gauge swatch, especially once you block it. In short, we block our swatches because of the differing growth that different fibers experience when they get wet. Sure, you could not block your swatch or your final garment, but what happens when you need to wash that sweater? Are you really going to want to risk dipping it in the bath without knowing what will happen? I sure won't. That's just a recipe for heartbreak. Blocking swatches helps us to eliminate that unknown factor that happens in blocking. We can rest assured that our final piece is going to be exactly as we want it, as we expect it, as it should be. For this video, I created 4 sample swatches. They're all made from yarns that are labeled as DK, but they're all different fibers. I also crocheted them with the exact same hook, and I made them all 24 stitches wide and 14 rows tall. Let me show you them pre-blocked, how I blocked them, and how they changed when they were blocked. Here are my 4 pre-blocked swatches. This one uses a superwash merino, this one's non-superwash merino, this one is acrylic, and the last one is bamboo. You can see, even pre-blocked, these swatches are not all the same size and therefore not all the same gauge. Before blocking your swatches, you need to record your pre-blocked gauge. Here is the pre-blocked gauge for each of these swatches. We'll compare them once they're blocked. To block your swatches, I recommend using a no-rinse yarn wash. I love the brand Soak because they are Canadian, but you can use whichever you like. Allow the swatches to soak for at least 15 minutes, then gently squeeze out excess water. I also lay mine inside a towel and step on it on the floor to get extra water out. Once the excess water has been wrung out of the swatches, pull gently on them just to see how they will respond to the gravity of the yarn's weight of your final piece. Do not pull hard. Gentle is the name of the game. You're only adding a few hundred grams to this piece at most, so there is no need to pull on the swatches. Regarding the pinning of swatches, I do not recommend pinning for blocking of swatches, and I also don't recommend it for blocking of garments unless there is some kind of lace detailing that isn't opening up well without the help of pins. I find when people are pinning their swatches in garments, they're forcing the yarn and the fibers to do things that they don't naturally want to do, and it ends up skewing the gauge and the yardage by too much. So just a gentle tug and lay flat to dry. Technically, you should wait for your swatch to dry before remeasuring the blocked gauge, as some fibers may rebound a little bit from the stretching. After blocking, these are the gauges of my 4 swatches. As you can see, each changed by different amounts. My acrylic swatch only changed a little, my non-superwash changed by 1 stitch in 1 row, and my superwash and bamboo swatches changed by a fair bit. Now, what happens if your pre-blocked swatch and your post-block swatch have a different gauge, as all 4 of my examples did. How can we factor that into the making of a whole piece? Because you measured both your pre and your post block gauge, it is going to be easy peasy for you. The measurement before blocking is the gauge you are going to want to maintain while you're making your piece. The measurement after blocking is what will give you the correct sized final piece. Getting gauge in a swatch is not enough. You need to maintain it in your piece too. And it needs to be the pre-blocked gauge that you're maintaining while you're making. I'm going to say that a lot in this video. Many of my designs are created top down and have instructions in the pattern like repeat previous round until you reach X number of rounds, or until your top reaches the desired length, keeping in mind growth due to blocking. What does that mean, and how do we calculate that expected growth due to blocking? Don't worry, I'm going to give you the formula. This only works if you are achieving the same pre-blocked gauge that you did in your swatch, and if your blocked swatch matched the pattern in the gauge. Make sure you're checking your gauge often as you work, and get ready to take a screenshot, as I'm going to be putting some formulas up on the screen. Step 1, you're going to take 4 inches or 10 centimeters, or whatever the gauge measurement is in the pattern. You'll multiply that by the number of stitches or rows you are calculating for, and then divide by the blocked gauge number of stitches or rows. And it will give you a measurement in inches or centimeters, depending on if you did imperial or metric. Essentially, this is just good old cross multiplication that you, like me, probably told your high school math teacher you would never use. And look at us. Look at us. Look at us. So your formula can also look like this. It's the same thing, you're just cross multiplying. Whether you write it in one line or you cross multiply it like this, the steps are the same. Once you have calculated for A, your final length, you subtract your current length to figure out how many inches or centimeters your piece will grow, and the formula looks like this. A minus current length, or width, because this works for width as well, equals your expected growth. If you are calculating for width, just make sure that you use the stitch gauge instead of the row gauge, or vice versa if the pieces work side to side. If the pattern you are using gives final measurements in a schematic, and you're achieving the correct pre-blocked gauge, and you're following the pattern exactly as it's written, you can assume that your final piece will match the measurements given in the schematic in the pattern. If that is the whole case for you, you can skip the cross multiplying and just know your piece is going to be that same expected length because you got your gauge right and you're checking that pre-blocked gauge. But let's say you want to add or subtract length, or you change the stitch count for the body. Your measurements won't match the schematic. So you can use the formulas to calculate your expected measurements based on the changes that you made. These formulas also work for patterns that do not contain schematics. It's all just based on your pre-blocked versus the pattern's final blocked gauge numbers. I know that's a lot. I learned through doing, so let's go through an example together. We will use my superwash swatch as the example since it's what I work with most commonly and it changed a fair bit in blocking. My pre-blocked gauge on this was 17 stitches by 10.5 rows. And yes, you can use halves or quarters. That's fine. It'll just get you a more accurate number. Let's pretend that I am making a t-shirt out of this yarn. I want to make sure I am frequently measuring the gauge on the actual t-shirt that I'm making and matching it to the pre-blocked gauge of my swatch, which was 17 stitches by 10.5 rows. And let's say I want to figure out how long it's going to be, how much it's going to grow in length when I block it. Let's say the project is 40 rounds, but it's seeming a little short for how I want it to be, but I know it's going to grow because my swatch grew. I take the number of rows, 40, times it by 4 inches or 10 centimeters, and divide by the number of rows in my blocked gauge, 9. 40 times 4 divided by 9 equals 17.8 inches. or 40 times 10 divided by 9 equals 44.4 centimeters. Currently, at my pre-blocked gauge, my piece is only 15.2 inches or 38.1 centimeters long. I subtract the current length from the expected length to find out how many inches or centimeters it will grow. 17.8 minus 15.2 equals 2.6 inches, or 44.4 minus 38.1 equals 6.3 centimeters. That's the expected growth. This formula works the exact same way for stitch growth too. So instead of using 40 rows or rounds, you could input the number of stitches around the bust, say, to see how much it will change during blocking as well. And that's it. That's why it's important to block your swatches. So you can match your pre-blocked gauge while you're making and have your gauge spot on after blocking and have a finished garment that fits as it's intended to fit or as you want it to fit. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my upcoming workshop on using gauge to modify your garments to your body via the link in the description below. And I'll see you next week where we will talk all about the implications of gauge and blocking our swatches in size inclusion. Happy crocheting! See you next time.